I want to talk about a somewhat disturbing trend in the community I've been seeing over the last 10 or 11 months, where everybody keeps saying the phrase, hopefully it'll be fixed in Flight Sim 2024. But to be honest, I'm really not that confident that that's going to be the case. Hey guys, Captain Cherbus here. Today I want to talk to you guys about an issue I've been spending about 3 to 5 hours per day over the last 7 weeks investigating on my computer with Flight Sim 2020. So to give you some background, I'm running an NVIDIA RTX 4090 with an AMD Ryzen 7950 X3D along with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. So that should be more than enough to handle any flying situation in Flight Simulator 2020. I primarily fly airliners in Flight Sim, and I like to go on VAT Sim for the majority of my flights. I'm usually flying the PMDG 737 along with the Leonardo Mad Dog, and I also like to fly the Phoenix A320 and the Unibuilds A300. I can easily get in excess of 120 frames per second in most scenarios in 4K with frame gen on. However, I prefer to cap my frames around like 85 to 90 just for consistency and avoiding wild fluctuations while I'm flying around. So here's the issue. A few months ago, I started to consistently encounter stutters on takeoff, like right at the point of liftoff as you're kind of just starting the rotation. And then even more prominently began getting really bad stutters when I was approaching airports. And it was extremely bad when I would get like in the final 300 feet all the way down right into the flare, which is getting really frustrating since that's by far the most exciting part of the flight, and it was incredibly immersion breaking as it was being wrecked by these stutters. So once the issue began to happen, I did the most rational thing that any simmer would obviously do, which is you just start toning down the settings. I was already simming with most settings on high or medium. I don't really go for all of the fancy reflections and all the things that the 4090 and the AMD 79X3D can do. I really value the smoothness of the flight rather than the amazing eye candy that Microsoft can offer us. So I just started to kind of go after the main culprits, which was the terrain level of detail along with the object level of detail. So I was already simming around like anywhere from like 60 to 100 on average on those sliders. So I brought it down to 50, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. And even on the absolute minimum settings, I was still getting those same game-breaking stutters on the liftoff at certain airports and the approach. So this just left me completely stumped. Now, when lowering the settings failed, I spent countless hours doing every single tweak that I could find online to my operating system, my system settings, my BIOS, you know, the great old shader cache clearing, and everything. I've been trying the auto FPS, which is actually a great add-on. I highly recommend it. However, it would never address what I was experiencing, which was these stutters approaching the airports, the landings, and the liftoffs. No matter what I was trying, absolutely nothing was solving these stuttering problems. Now, I happen to have a large collection. I love buying and supporting our Payware developers, our third-party add-on developers. And so 99.9% of the time that I'm flying into a really detailed Payware scenery. And this is where I was experiencing all of the stutters. So what exactly is the issue and what exactly is going on? For that, I use ChatGPT to try to make like a really simple diagram. So what you're looking at here is a simple diagram of 2 rings. I have like a 5-mile ring, which is this outer circle, and this like 1-mile ring, which is like, that would be right around the terminal where you have the buildings, the taxiway signs, and the gates. So in my experience, what we're seeing is there's stutters that are occurring at 2 different phases of the approach and the takeoff. So right around like 3 to 5 miles, you're going to start seeing the airport scenery start to load in. So the main terminals, the big buildings, the hotels, and any other cool extra add-on stuff that the Payware developer put around the airport. Now, this doesn't occur at every single airport. It seems like some developers have figured this out and others either haven't figured it out or just don't care. What took me so long to figure this out is that when I'm flying on VATSIM, I'm usually heads down, especially on the approach. So I'm not really looking out the window. But since I've done so many flights on VATSIM over the last few months, I'm starting to see now the real root cause of this. So when you're coming in at this 5 mile range, like I said, you're going to start seeing these buildings popping in. Now, when they pop in, these a lot of the times will coincide perfectly with that stutter. We call that, the typical scenery popping. But what's interesting is that a SOBO scenery, like the default trees, photogrammetry, and all of their stuff with their default airports, it doesn't seem doesn't seem like their scenery popping causes any stutters. So there's something about the optimization or texture loading or object level of detail that causes these add-on scenery pops to cause these stutters, like in that 3 to 5 mile range. And so that's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed. The second type of stutters that I'm getting on these approaches is really on the short final, when the call outs start happening like 300, 200, 150. When that starts happening, what you're going to notice is taxiway signs start popping in, gate details start popping in, vehicles start popping in from the developer. And this is the absolute worst type of stutter, because this is where you're making your final fine adjustments for the flare. And this is a complete game wrecker for my personal experience. And I've seen dozens of people all over the internet on flight sim, on the flight simulator forums, on the ABSIM forums, and even on the developer forums like PMDG. Nobody can really tell what exactly is going on, and nobody's really offering a solution. But what it is that the scenery from some of these payware developers is popping in, and it's creating these stutters right in the last 300 feet, 400 feet, 500 feet of the approach. So that is depicted by, like, I put this 1 mile ring. These really are just game breaking when these stutters occur inside this little tiny range in here. Okay, so now I want to talk about the third type of stutter that I've been seeing consistently with very highly detailed airports. This is going to be the one on takeoff. It's a little bit different than the ones we discussed about how these stutters happen on landing. So for this example, I have this diagram of an airport. We have a main terminal with, some nice vehicles parking, and we're parked kind of here in the middle. We're getting okay performance because we're just on the ground. Everything is pre-cached around us when we load it into the sim. And so we're not going to really experience many stutters. But let's say the air traffic controller gives us clearance for pushback and taxi. So we push back here and we make our way out here. Everything's going great. We're taxiing. We come to the holding point for the runway. Everything looks good. And now we take position on the runway for takeoff. We get our takeoff clearance. We're rolling. Everything seems great. And now we get to right around this point, V1, rotate. And amazingly, we get these weird, strange stutters as we are departing. Now, what I believe is causing this is that when we pushed back, all of this scenery was in our frame of view, and it was loaded on our object level of detail and terrain level of detail field. And then as we taxied away from it, it loses its detail, which it should, because we want good performance as we're taxiing away. And the sim thinks, oh, we've left the very detailed region, so we don't have to render all of the details in the terminal. And that is working as it should. But when we make this turn onto the runway, what the sim hasn't realized is we're going to go full speed right by this unrendered scenery that just a minute ago was rendered. So we begin to roll down the runway. And when we get to this point, the sim and the scenery says, oh my goodness, we need to render all of this stuff all at once. And we're ready for one of the most intense parts of our flight, where we need smooth performance to nicely pull off and rotate off the runway. And that is what I believe is causing a lot of the stuttering problems on takeoff. Now, one of the largest offenders of this problem that I consistently see, and I hate to call out certain developers, but I'm only bringing you guys up because I want you to do better and I support you guys 100% financially when I buy your add-ons, is Drizeki design. I get these stutters like crazy on approach and takeoff as the scenery is popping and loading in. It's nothing personal. It's just something I notice with that particular developer. Any builds, I get a lot of the same issues consistently happening, particularly on the approaches, the buildings not rendering in like main terminals and stuff, and I'll get that 3 to 5 mile radius. And then BM World, AmSim, I get those bad stutters on takeoff and landing. And I think all three of those developers make incredible quality scenery, but there's something off with the optimization and the way that the rendering radius is just not working good with the sim, and not even working on high-end hardware like the stuff I'm running. There are other developers that I've had really good experiences with and other developers that I haven't, but I think I've got over 360 or 70 Payware airports, and it would take me extremely long amount of time to test each and every single one of them to see how their scenery is rendering in and if it's affecting the approach and takeoff with the stutterings. So I'm just making a broad generalization with three that I know for sure have this issue. I'm not saying that some have it and some don't. I'm just letting you know those are three because I fly primarily in the continental United States, Europe, and Australia. Those ones really have an issue with this. Okay, so whose fault is this really? Probably a bit of both Microsoft Asobo, and a lot of the onus is also probably on the developer. Since I'm not a scenery developer, I can't really tell you exactly who's at fault. But since some airports seem to have excellent optimization, you know, the way that the scenery is loading in and it doesn't create stutters, it's proof that airports can be built to load scenery on approach in a way that doesn't really create stuttering. However, the vast majority of the Payware that I own and fly into on a regular basis does give very bad stuttering at various points on the approach path. Like I said earlier, sometimes it's that 3 to 5 mile range where the terminal buildings are loading in, and sometimes it's the jetways, taxiway signs, and those vehicles that really screw things up in that last 300 feet of the approach. The evidence that like some airports don't have this issue means there is a methodology of best practices, and I really believe that that should be shared by Asobo with the scenery developers. They should be collaborating to come up with like a best practices methodology so that customers like me will want to buy and use their scenery so we can continue to grow the hobby and support the incredible developers who make this hobby so amazing. At the end of the day, what we want to do is get an incredibly usable, stutter-free product that delights the customers so that they keep coming back and buying more and more, and everybody is happy, and it makes the developers' lives a lot easier when they're not guessing whether their scenery is going to cause these issues or not. Like I mentioned earlier, a very interesting observation is that the scenery popping on the ortho photogrammetry, the plants, the buildings, the roads, etc., in the distance when you have your TLOD set to, 150 or 200 or even higher, that doesn't seem to be causing any stuttering, especially on high-end systems like the one that I'm running. Meaning Asobo seems to have figured out a solid way to load their scenery into the sim without causing issues. That's more evidence that it's possible to load in Payware sceneries without stutters if there was a more transparent methodology that was being shared between Asobo, Microsoft, and these third-party developers, which I think we really want to encourage that level of communication. I want to make very clear that I never mentioned performance degradation as in frame rates that's causing the issues. That's not what I'm talking about here. I understand that dense scenery, whether it's default photogrammetry or Payware airports, can and will cause more stress on the computer. Sometimes that's going to result in a loss of frames per second, of course. I'm only bringing up the stutters, which break the immersion. And in many cases, it's going to screw up approaches and landing flares, which is what the frustrating part is after doing a nice long flight offline or online. Drops in frame rates, on the other hand, are not an issue. I regularly will see a 10 to 20% decrease in frames per second when I'm running dense scenery airports, but still maintain smooth performance, which is what I'm really shooting for. So what's the goal of this video? What I want to do is I'm really trying to bring attention to Asobo and the third-party developers that although I absolutely love this simulator and all of the add-ons being created for it, and I want to continually financially support the amazing ecosystem of developers so we can continue to grow the hobby well into the future. I want to make sure that when myself or another customer spends money on Payware scenery, that they're going to get the maximum enjoyment out of it and not have to suffer with stuttering on takeoff and landing due to the way that the loading algorithms or the methodology work or how well optimized the developer made the scenery load in. I want to talk about a somewhat disturbing trend in the community I've been seeing over the last 10 or 11 months, where everybody keeps saying the phrase, hopefully it'll be fixed in Flight Sim 2024. But to be honest, I'm really not that confident that that's going to be the case. I have a strong suspicion that a lot of the architecture from Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is still going to be present in Flight Sim 2024. And I want to make sure that the way sceneries are loaded into the sim is addressed. It benefits the customers, but also the developers who develop these Payware add-ons for the community to make sure their customers keep coming back to buy more and more scenery if the issues with loading scenery is resolved. Now, I've owned and operated several large software companies, and I can tell you, if I had $1 for every time one of my developers told me that this is going to be fixed in the next update, I'd literally be a trillionaire. So this is a very disturbing trend that everybody thinks the new version is going to address these things. Part of the problem, I believe, is that the people who are building these add-ons don't necessarily use it the way you and I are using it. Let me explain. Let's say Sobo has a team of 100 testers. What they're probably doing is they're taking a drone cam around the airport and going in and out and weaving in and out of the airport area and looking at the terminals and looking at the details. And once they've spent a few hours looking at everything in the terminal area, they're probably saying, this looks good. And that makes sense. They obviously have a limited amount of time. They're paying people lots of money. They don't have the necessary time or use case that somebody that's flying on VATSIM or flying a full route is going to experience. So the way we're using the software is completely different than the testers that they've hired. The way we're using the software is we're flying in from a different state. We're approaching the airport. We have many apps running, like we might be running vPilot, we might be running FSLTL, we might be running Active Sky. There's a lot of things going on our systems. And then we make a controlled descent into the terminal area with live weather. And this is just something that they're not going to be doing. Like I said, what I believe they're doing is they're taking the camera around within a half-mile radius of the airport and looking at everything in great detail. So I think a lot of the time they're missing the scenery pop load in from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 miles out, which is creating all these stutters. All of their stuff that they're viewing is already pre-cached, and they're kind of looking for little detail problems versus a user is coming in on an approach and their stuff isn't pre-cached and they're experiencing a completely different scenery load-in profile. And this is what I think is causing a lot of the miscommunication that needs to be bridged better by users and the testers. Another slightly disturbing and concerning revelation that I'm having is that one of the worst culprits of this stuttering issue that I've experienced is AnyBuild scenery. Now, I absolutely love AnyBuilds. I own all of their products. I'm a huge supporter in what they're doing, and I think they are an amazing part of the flight simulation community. But considering that their scenery is one of the worst culprits of this stuttering issue as you approach their airports from 3 to 5 miles out getting stutters, and then inside that 1 mile ring, I get lots of stutters. It's concerning because they are partnered directly with Microsoft Flight Simulator and build many of their aircraft, and I'm sure they're involved in a lot of their other development. And so the fact that they're sceneries have this issue leads me to believe that it's not going to be fixed necessarily in Flight Sim 2024 if these guys have direct insider access and are plugged right into Asobo and Microsoft. The thing that's interesting about the stuttering issue is it's agnostic to the size of the airport. I've had this issue happen on little tiny one runway fields with a tiny little terminal. It's agnostic to the size or the density of the scenery around it. If the objects are not programmed to load incorrectly, or if Microsoft's algorithms are handling it in some quack way, I'm still getting the stutter. So there could be zero planes around. There could be a completely open field somewhere in Eastern Europe, and still these stutters will occur. So my final thought on this and my call to action is that if you're a scenery developer, but preferably I'd love to talk to somebody at Asobo or Microsoft, I will be more than happy to test any scenery loading algorithms and methodology for you and give feedback until a solution is found that doesn't create stutters. I have several thousand hours of software beta testing experience since I've built and run several software as a service companies in a completely different industry. So I have a keen eye for discovering bugs and what may be causing them. I don't want to be paid for this. I still buy all of my sceneries directly from the marketplace or third-party outlets, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford any new sceneries that come out. So my only intentions here are just to fix the stuttering problem so that we as a community can all enjoy the simulator way, way more. All right, that's it for me. Captain Chairbus out.